Okay, and here we are. First time, I think it's 4 weeks or something like that since we've
Yeah,
met.
it's 4 weeks. Yeah, I had to kind of cut the other one off because of some kind of I was doing some medical related thing, and I just at the time I was not in any position to do any kind of recording or anything like that. So
Yeah, yeah, no worries. And I've had a pretty busy few weeks actually too. So I was quite happy for us to skip one and then resume.
yeah.
So, and here we are. So I've got a few items on the agenda tonight. Women's suffrage.
Okay,
Shall we start there?
let's go ahead and
So
start there.
great. This has been pretty topical, I think, because Pearl Davis has exploded onto the scene in recent months. But I mean, she's been coming up for a little while, but I think in recent months her viewership has really exploded. She has interviewed Mike Buchanan from Justice for Men and Boys in the UK and Elizabeth Hobson as well in the UK. I know both Ellie and Mike. And I believe there's some other plans for some people to be interviewed as well coming up. But it's interesting, actually. I mean, some people have called Pearl the female Tate. I
Andrew
forgot
Tate.
now. And thank you,
Andrew
Andrew
Tate.
Tate.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew Tate. Especially since he was arrested and he was then released, but I think bailed, and then I think there may be some charges pending at the moment. So he was incommunicado for a little while, and it was around about that time that Pearl Davis really came onto the scene, or really exploded onto the scene. She'd been around for a while, but exploded onto the scene. Anyway, I said she's interviewed a few people I know, but interestingly enough, she holds a position that women shouldn't vote. Now, she's not the first the first woman that I've heard actually say this. So Janet Bloomfield, who used to actually be with the Voice for Men for a while, she's retired from all activism now, but she actually also held this position that women shouldn't vote. So anyway, just given that Pearl's openly stating this position, and a number of her opponents said it, and I wanted to double check, and I've heard her say it a number of times. So I just I thought that's an interesting topic to discuss.
Sure. Well, why don't we start off with your thoughts? I think you're kind of really eager to start something off.
Yeah, no worries. So it's interesting because this isn't the first time there have been women who are against women's suffrage. In the 19th century, it was when. See, this comes back to, we've talked about this before, the origins of suffrage and how in the 19th century, suffrage, of course, being the right to vote, was primarily tied to property. So generally, if you had property, you had the right to vote. It wasn't always the case, but in many cases, women who had the right to vote, who had property gained with it the right to vote. I've looked at the UK, which is an example where we have a lot of data on this, and it seems like they were inconsistent in their application of this. So it seems like in some areas, landholding women didn't vote, whereas in other areas, landholding women did vote. And interestingly enough, even some relatively poor women actually voted in the UK. And anyway, so there were so the idea that of a right to vote was something that became generally accepted in the 19th century. It had existed before ancient Athens, and there'd been a few other cases, but in terms of most people accepting this as a concept, it was really in the late 19th century that happened. So, but there were women who were anti women's suffrage in the 19th century, and it seemed to be that was a lot of people, at least today, think that they were probably concerned about the obligations that went along. For example, did an obligation of military service go along with the vote? In which case, did women voting make them liable for military service? And that's something a lot of women didn't want. So that's one of the arguments that's been put forward. They would tend to argue too that they would tend to be more on the conservative side and so forth, and looking for a more traditional role. Although, as we've said before, it's not necessarily that traditional for women to be living at home. But in the 19th century, a lot of women, a lot of middle class women started to be housewives. Anyway, so that's sort of in the 19th century, there was quite a lot of women's lobby against suffrage. But the idea of women today making that argument is something that's a bit more unusual and would probably surprise people. But this is a position that Pearl Davis takes. So I'm just going to, I had some notes here and I'm just going to grab them.
Did she elaborate why she it was against it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, yeah, I'd probably actually say watch her videos and get her thoughts on it, because I do think that there's generally a couple of arguments that people put forward, and it's usually to do with claiming that women are saying they're more emotional and so forth, and have high, and certainly when we know, for example, women have high neuroticism and so forth. Interestingly enough, I was just watching another video earlier today. I haven't finished watching it, where the young woman there, I don't think she's coming quite out and saying women shouldn't have the vote, but she was defending Dennis Prager, who's apparently come out and said something similar, or said that, no, I should clarify. He didn't say women should have the vote. He said that women are destroying this country, in reference to the US, which I think there were fairly political overtones there. But my position is that universal suffrage is important. I think it comes with some. I think there are definitely problems associated with it, but I think that the risk of removing suffrage from any particular demographic at this point, I think that far outweighs any potential benefit we might see from doing so. Because once you've opened that door, it seems to be a bit of a Pandora's box. Once you open that door and you say that you can exclude people from suffrage on the basis of characteristic like gender or ethnicity potentially, then I think there's huge risks associated with that. So anyway, that's the position I've taken. There's a few reasons why I've taken that position, which I'm happy to discuss. I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
I do have thoughts. I just want to hear yours first.
All right, cool. All right, no worries at all. So, fundamentally, suffrage is not just about having a say in government. By the way, before I go on, I want to say that I'm with Winston Churchill on this. Winston Churchill is credited as having said, it's often the case that sayings are attributed to famous people. As far as I know, he did say this. He's credited as having said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all of the others. And in that, I'm with him. It's absolutely the case that democracy has some quite serious problems. And we see those short-term cycles, politicians being focusing on the next voting cycle, the next election and so forth. But I think overall it has turned out better than any other form of government. And this comes down to what the key point was: universal suffrage. So universal suffrage isn't just about having a say in government. It's also about the government being accountable to the voters. Now, we've certainly seen over the last few decades many men hauled across the coals despite being voters. And I think this is certainly an indication of how democracy can fall short of its aims. There are plenty there. So having the vote hasn't saved men from being hauled over the coals. Some people would probably argue that it's because women had the vote that this has caused a problem. I think it's more complicated than that. There've certainly been plenty of men who were prepared to throw other men under a bus, for example. But anyway, even if it doesn't work properly, a fundamental aspect of democracy is the notion that you have that the elected officials are accountable to the voters. And this involves, and jump in at any time, so I'm going to go through my points, but if you want to jump in any time there, Vernon, this involves having recourse to politicians if you feel you've been robbed by the state. And without going into details, I personally have contacted politicians when I believe I have been wronged by the state. And I have actually had satisfactory results from doing that. Not everybody does. I have. But I had a matter that was dragging on and on and on. And from the date when I wrote the letter and posted it, because it was pre-email, to the date when the matter was resolved was 10 days. So, and I know from my time in the police, we have something, it was called a ministerial file. There was some sort of police matter. I wasn't directly involved in it. Some sort of police matter where somebody felt they'd been wronged, or the matter was taking too long, or whatever. And this came down. The person wrote to their politician. The politician wrote to the minister for police. That came down then poured down the chain of command. And a police officer who I knew was called into a meeting and handed the file and said, "This is what you do until it is resolved." That's all she did, right? And then she went off. She had no other responsibilities than to resolve that file. Went off, resolved the file, hopefully to the person's satisfaction, but at least it was fast. Whatever happened, I don't know the details, but it was fast. So I think that is important, having recourse to politicians. As it's far from it working perfectly, but it has seemed to work better than many other systems. Uh, yeah, so I just wanted to reiterate something I was touching on before, that both men and women have allowed misandric laws to pass despite universal suffrage. And I think, as I said before, I think that's to a large degree because men were willing to throw other men under a bus. If men as a group, being nearly half the electorate, objected to misandric laws, I think we could have stopped a lot of them. By the way, women are more likely to vote than men. That's been shown. And the difference isn't as great in Australia, where we have universal suffrage. Mandatory voting. But in countries, especially in countries with optional voting, women are, well, certainly women are generally a majority of the population, adult women, and they're also more likely to vote per capita. So women have coming out of maybe 52 to 55% of the vote in countries like the US, I think. But nevertheless, I think there was potential there. If enough men stood up against misandric laws, I think we could have done something about it. So I think it's the fact that men have not been willing to do that has really been the problem there.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So go on.
Yeah. Because I know a lot of people like to say that, women voting caused X problem, so we need to re-ban the idea of women voting. Well,
Yeah.
so this is not it's the farthest thing from a gynocentric argument on my part, right? Like, so we're not going to get into to some of my own personal beliefs about voting, which I'm kind of. I'll have to slightly echo the Winston Churchill argument about it
Mm.
being the worst form of government except for all the others. But more to the point, basically, I'm not terribly fond of the idea of voting on someone's rights. You know, like
Uh,
rights being subject to majority vote, that sort of that context, right?
yeah.
We're not going to get into that so much, but
Might be an interesting discussion for another time, though, actually.
probably.
Yes.
But well, incidentally, it seems like these women do seem to want to vote on others' rights, especially men's rights.
Mm.
To be sure.
One that occurred to me actually was Switzerland is a very, very democratic country, and they send a lot of things to votes in that, so very democratic in that sense. And they had a situation a while back where they had a referendum on abolishing male military obligations, as in conscription, and the country voted to retain it. And my understanding is it was carried by the women's vote. So had only men voted on it, it would have been abolished, which I think is interesting. And I was personally disappointed at that one. But anyway, go on. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Like, so the way they kind of harp on the vote so much, and I think the vote is a bit of a red herring. It's a distraction, if anything,
Mm-hmm.
because it's really a question of making sure making women accountable for themselves. No, so everybody's talking about the
Mm.
vote. We're not talking about women's philosophies and actions and such. It,
That's a very good point. If I may jump in there, I guess you're saying there that if we removed vote for women, we essentially would be pushing back their accountability, and they would have a justified reason for saying they weren't accountable if they didn't have a vote. Actually, if I
yeah, well,
understand
yeah.
your argument
Well,
correctly.
I suppose so. Like more to the point, like let's just say that it will be a conservative that would say that the women's vote was a mistake, right?
Mm.
Um, Now the problem is that is very much like saying, you know, guns caused X tragedy. We have to ban guns, but the conservatives won't say that, right? This is like the one thing
Mm.
that they won't. And I'm with the
That's true.
conservatives on this one. Don't
Mm.
you shouldn't ban guns just because of one incident or and such. In fact, banning guns is probably what caused the problem. Um, uh, the point I'm making with that one is that it's it's very deferring of accountability. Um, it's like
Yes.
since women are individuals and they must be treated like this if any of this kind of centrism is going to cancel itself out, it's not going to clearly at this rate, right? But that's the thing. Um, we're kind of treating it as if it's going to solve anything at this point. Not now that women have had this vote for some time, now the direction is to either, so long as we have the vote, my own personal views on it notwithstanding, we have to uh, get people in a better, more libertarian and more pro male mindset, and that's where we have to kind of work towards instead of just
Yes.
abolishing the vote. Um,
Yes, I
so
agree.
yeah, yeah, right. Now, on a funny note here, I'm more ironic to kind of put some irony into what I'm trying to say here. Uh, you know, it's a fun discussion. Is this because of the women's vote? Is it because of women's desire to control men? This is something that Milton Friedman, the economist, once said in a show. But uh, he mentioned that during wartime, like this is during the Prohibition era, right, in the United States, where alcohol was actually banned.
Yeah.
Um, the men went to war, and the women who remained voted in Prohibition.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what.
yeah.
Yeah, that's just the way he said it. He just said, that's a pure statement of historical fact. And
Right.
the audience, a lot of them were women, and they were like giving him the mean eye for that.
It's
But
that's interesting actually because today effort is made to make sure that soldiers vote, but I suppose in World War One structurally that wasn't something that they were probably able to achieve.
right, it's like yeah, that's the way he described it. So I need to
Yeah,
verify it myself, but
yeah.
it
I hadn't
just
actually come across that. That's interesting. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But that's where we kind of want to zero in on. Let's
Hmm.
get women to be accountable, not just harp on the fact that the women's vote was a mistake. It's irrelevant to me. I don't really think about it, and a lot of people try to goad the question. Like
Mm-hmm.
I remember, when I was on Honey Badger Radio at one point, Brian loved asking this question. Like he
Hmm.
was kind of, if you're listening, Brian, uh, uh, we can chat about this. But yeah, he really seemed to want to press the question, like trying to get me to answer one way or another. And the
Hmm.
thing is, at the time, I was really trying to counter by saying, well, I've got my own libertarian views that voting it is there's too much weight given to voting.
Hmm.
And so, but like yeah, he wanted me to answer one way or another. He really wanted to kind of hear me say the women's vote was a mistake, and yeah,
Interestingly enough, it's a bit of an aside. The ancient Athenians, which were, of course, a direct democratic society, bearing in mind that they never had more than about 50,000
mhm,
citizens. So they're fairly manageable numbers. But they actually used to use lot, draw a lot of positions by lot. They didn't actually, as far as I understand, the more important positions did not tend to be democratically assigned, voted on. They tended to be drawn by lot. In ancient Athens, they may have believed the gods were giving their, maybe were influencing that. But nevertheless, it was interesting that there's actually something to be said by randomly allocating positions. There's actually some arguments in favour of doing that in certain cases. You might, for example, I mean, some ideas have been proposed. For example, rather than voting on politicians, but you just randomly select a group of people, and you might actually because you'll take away the problems of politicians are self-selected towards people who are wanting to that role and have certain characteristics because of it. Anyway, so I'm not necessarily suggesting that as a better system than democracy, but it is interesting that this idea has actually been floated.
yeah,
So maybe, who knows? Maybe in the future we may mitigate democracy in ways we're not at the moment. But my view is that, yeah, essentially, I think going along similar lines to what you're saying, we need to be very vigilant about these sort of problems. And I think probably education and, like you say, get people, certainly men, thinking about war, about not throwing other men under a bus, and thinking about ways that this can benefit the entire society, including men. We
exactly.
might be able to get rid of some of these misandric laws.
Mhm.
So.
Right, right, and that's a tangential thing. Like a real big gripe I have with people on the right at this point is that they're always focusing on all these bans on this or
Mm,
that. They're
mm,
focusing on the bans instead of persuasion.
mm,
Because one, uh, I'm against child transition surgeries, right?
mm.
But
Yes.
but the problem is, there's so much talk of this. What I'm going to say is it's going to sound very misconstruable, so I'm going to have to
Hmm.
phrase it very carefully. But they're always talking about banning the surgeries, but they're not saying why. They're putting less emphasis, in my opinion, on why
Hmm.
it's not a very good idea. And the problem is they're most of the time they're just preaching to their own choir, right? So to
Hmm.
the people that they're preaching to, they don't even need the ban in the first place because they're not going to bother with such a stupid thing, right?
Yes. Yes.
Right. And so, the people that they're trying to get them to stop, you're not getting through to them because they're just going, if a ban were to happen, they'll try and fight to overturn the ban anyway, or they'll try and circumvent the ban by doing it even more illicitly.
Hmm.
Uh, kind of that it's like, you
I
know,
guess, if I may,
yeah,
you're talking about more about education, maybe explaining to people why it's a bad idea rather
right, yeah,
than simply trying to hit the ban hammer on.
exactly. It's more deference of accountability, I think. So,
Yeah, and that's a good point, particularly in, say, genital mutilation, whether it's male genital mutilation or female. Well,
mm,
currently, male genital mutilation is not illegal anywhere. Female
right,
genital mutilation is illegal in a large number of countries, particularly Western
yes,
countries. So, people who are proponents of FGM would take their daughters overseas back to their home country where they would obtain the procedure,
yeah,
return. So, then a number of countries have banned removing children for the purposes of genital mutilation. But the problem is,
right,
again, there are ways around that. How can you
yeah.
genitively say that was the reason why the child was removed? It must be very difficult to prosecute on that basis. As you say, the bans don't really work, do they, to a large degree?
Exactly. And I'm not saying that a ban on, say, MGM is something I won't be happy with, right? Like if it happened tomorrow, I'll be kind of thrilled.
Yeah.
Uh yeah, but to say the least. But uh you know, intactivists talk a lot about the ban, but I say we should place more emphasis on getting through.
I
Yeah.
agree. Yes, I'm also in favour of a ban on MGM and FGM. Okay, and gender modification of children. But you're right. The emphasis needs to be not
Right.
on an authoritarian approach of just coming down on people who do it, but educating people as to why it shouldn't happen. Yes.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do that, then it just becomes a back and forth war on
Mm.
banning it, unbanning it. You know, imagine banning it and seeing how the conservatives reacted to this one. They're going to be completely up in arms. And
Yep. That's
they're going to talk about their constitutional right to circumcise and mutilate their own sons. So,
yes. Do you know? I see a parallel here actually to the climate discussion. If I may comment, people who say climate debate, whatever.
mhm,
A lot of people there are some people who argue that climate change represents an existential threat to humanity. There are other people who wholly reject climate change. Okay, and these two groups aren't able to talk to each other to a large degree. I've been struck how often people who are advocating for environmental causes like climate change, or particularly climate, who they will push this issue down, then end up really quite probably being very rude in many cases to the people who reject climate change. Whereas my view is that there are all sorts of reasons to, for example, remove or eliminate our reliance on fossil fuels that have nothing to do with the climate. I've always said if it was proven tomorrow that climate change wasn't occurring, anthropomorphic climate change, my view on our need to get off fossil fuels would not change because there are so many reasons why we need to get off fossil fuels that have nothing to do with the climate. There's pollution. There are environmental damage as a result of oil extraction. There's the fact that the big one, I think, the fact it's a finite resource, which we're going to run out of, and we really need to shift before we get off it. There's the fact that large sources of it come from unstable parts of the world, as we already saw. That's somewhat changed. North America is a big oil producer now. but the Middle East is still very big. The oil weapon was used in the 70s. It could potentially be used again. So my point is, without I wasn't intending to go off onto the environmental aspect, but my point is that if you're a proponent of if you're worried about the environment, okay, and you talk to someone, you say, we need to stop using oil because climate change. If they reject the climate change argument, what I see too often is that people just keep arguing on that, and they never actually get anywhere. Don't bother about that. Talk about all the other reasons why we should be getting off oil. If you've met someone who does it, because you talk to them, and I've talked to people, almost everybody will agree with those arguments in terms of about the finite resourcing and various other, and the fact that it comes from an unstable part of the world and so forth. People will agree on that, and most people will say, yes, we do need to get off oil on that basis. Anyway, so I just saw a parallel there.
I see what you're saying.
So, yes, because I'm big into sustainability in the sense that I would like, I think if I'm living in a particular way, I would like to think my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be able to live as well as me, and that I won't have done something like extract all the oil, which makes their life harder. So, right. So I think we had a really good discussion on women's suffrage, and I think we're pretty much, it seems, the nature of voting aside, because I'd love to have that discussion with you, actually. I think that in terms of women's suffrage versus universal suffrage, I think it sounds like we're pretty much on the same page, because we've never really talked about this. I sort of probably sprung this on you a little bit today, actually, because we haven't really talked about it, I don't think, in the past. So anyway, no, great. And I'm actually planning to write an article on it. I've actually made a couple of notes here, some of your points, actually. I'll credit you with those, but I think I'm going to mention those in my article. So
okay, sounds good.
Next, you go on.
Oh yeah. So do we really get to kind of I might have missed it. Why exactly Pearl had that opinion? Is just
you asked it before. I think probably it's better if people, I would say, get it from the horse's mouth, as it were, and hear her arguments about why she thinks so. I don't want to sort of misconstrue her arguments. So, but nevertheless, arguments aside, she is this is a position that she does hold, and as I said, I disagree with her on that position, and presented some of the reasons there, and I'll follow up with an article in which I discuss it.
Right.
So,
and those who don't know, when we're talking about Pearl Davis, if you might know her better as just Pearly Things, that's the same person, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's right. Yes.
Right. Yeah. I've never seen her stuff. Yeah, I've never seen her stuff. This is she's kind of new to me too. So
yeah, she's probably been on YouTube for a little while, but she's really exploded on the scene in the last 6 to 12 months. I'd say probably in the last 6 months, her viewership has really quite picked up. It is somewhere north of 1.5 million subscribers on YouTube, I think. Okay, demographic collapse is my next item. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on demographic collapse, which is, or you want me to just jump in?
You have to jump in because I don't have any context. I just got up today, so I don't.
Yes, no worries at all.
Yeah.
This has been something that has come up again. So for a bit of context, demographic collapse is the notion that the birth rate is going to get so low that it's going to become a problem for human civilizations. So demography is something that I've had an interest in since I was about 11. And I've been watching the birth rate over that time. This is probably not something that a lot of people paid attention to at the time. When I was 11, it was the early 80s, and I was reading sources. It was pre-internet, and so I was reading sources that were mostly written in the mid-70s. At the time, they were mostly predicting that the growth rate would start to slow. They hadn't yet seen it. By this time that I started to learn about these topics, the growth rate was starting to slow. And of course, it's interesting to watch. You can find plenty of graphs online that will basically the human population took until about 1800 to get to 1 billion. And I think 2 billion was in 1920. So that took about 120 years. Now I haven't looked at the exact numbers in some time. After that, it slowed. Well, there was a slowing there. I think the next one might have been 50 or 60 years. But then No, sorry. I forgive me. It was still speeding up at that point. Might have been 50 or 60 years. And then it went through, and at one point just recently, so I think there was one, we went up a billion in about 11 years. There was one that maybe even been quicker than that recently. I think 7 to 8 may have been the fastest billion. But we've reached 8 now, and we're starting to see that the period to the next billion will be longer, and the one after that will be longer again. The population is still growing, and it will get to 9 billion. It might get to 10 billion. It might get to 11 billion, but it's not almost certainly not going to go past that. And it's going to start falling. So that's what it's really looking like now. For when I was young, they believed that the population would probably level out somewhere at about 11 billion. And then basically, you imagine a world in the 22nd or 23rd century with essentially a static population of about 11 billion. That's now thought to be unlikely, and that the population will actually start to decline, maybe as soon as 2050, but certainly by 2100. So exactly how low it will go after that, we don't really know. So Western countries have to a large degree had a sub-replacement birth rate for the last few decades. The replacement birth rate, by the way, is 2.1 births per woman, not 2.0, as many might assume. So this is to account for the fact that some people die before they have an opportunity to reproduce and so forth. So most Western countries have been well below 2.1 for some time. They've been propping up their population through immigration. The US, I think, was the last major economy to actually start to fall below that number, as I recall. Interestingly enough, I heard somebody else claim recently that the US had fallen quite early, but I don't think that's true. That's not what I read. That's not what my reading suggests anyway, that the US actually held on for a while before starting to fall. South Korea is now 0.98 births per woman, I believe, and Japan isn't far behind. So I think the Japanese population has actually started to fall already. So this is something that,
it's a bit of a long-standing kind of conversation about the declining Japanese birth rates.
Right. And unlike Western countries, Japan is not bringing in enormous numbers of immigrants to prop up the population. So we're kind of seeing two different approaches to the problem here. The West is betting on population influx to prop up the numbers. I've heard the argument that Japan is working on automation as an alternative to offset the lack of future labour force. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I've read anyway. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I mean, that sounds kind of like something that they go for, to be sure.
Yeah. I suppose I don't know about South Korea, but I would imagine it's taking a similar approach to Japan, because then again, it doesn't have a large immigration program. But what's happened in the last 10 years, though, is that and again, I've had an interest in demography for a long time, so I've been watching this happen. The birth rate of many developing countries, which was quite high for a long time, has kind of fallen off a cliff in many places. So it's really dropped a lot more quickly than anyone was expecting. I think it may be in India has gone from something like 5.3 to 2.8. Don't quote me on that. But within about 10 years or something, we're talking those sorts of numbers. So enormous drop off. Africa's the only holdout at the moment. So if anywhere is going to be able to supply immigrants in the future, it's going to be Africa, because countries like Australia and Canada and the US, less so in the US, but countries that are relying heavily on immigrants to come in to prop up the population, there have to be immigrants prepared, first of all, that exist, and then they have to be prepared to come to your country. So even Africa's starting to see a decline, though. So I think the West needs to bear in mind that in 50 or 100 years, maybe there just won't be the immigrants available to bring in to prop up the numbers. So the main problem here, why you want to prop up the numbers, by the way, is that essentially people in the first half of their adult life, which is essentially the middle of their life, are when they're most productive. Children aren't very productive. They're learning. Then they become young adults. Young adults are very productive. And then people get older and they retire. And then they stop being productive again. And if the ratio of people who are productive to unproductive grows too much, the entire economy can't cope. Every society has cared for its elderly people and children. They've done it in different ways. Some societies do it informally. In the West, we do it formally with old age homes and so forth and schools. But every society going back to the origin of humanity has cared for its elderly and its children. And they've done that because there've been enough productive people to do it. But we're really looking at the potential of there not being enough productive people to do it. And this is a huge, huge problem. So interestingly, and this is something I want to look into more, you often hear the argument that it's linked to women's education. I've looked and I haven't seen any evidence to support that at all. If anyone's got any, by all means post it. I have not seen any evidence.
What's the argument? It's the lack of women's education that's causing the demographic collapse, or
they're saying there's a negative correlation between women getting more educated and number of children they have. So the more educated a woman gets, the less children she will have. Okay, and that's their argument. Now, I would suggest, I haven't seen any data that directly links it, even though you're almost certainly, everyone who talks about it will say this. And I've tried to look at their sources. I've tried to find them on my own. I haven't found anything that specifically says when women get more educated, they have less children. I think that what's probably happening, there's probably a few things happening. Education if anything, it could be societal education. That I could certainly see this entire society becoming more educated having an effect. Education is linked to affluence, and it's also linked to working. So I think that there may be indirect causes, like women going to work, for example, may well be causing them to have less children. And also to societal affluence, definitely. That is something that's well established. Societal affluence causes, and societal affluence is related to education, to correlates with education. But I haven't seen this direct connection between women's education and having less children. I suspect it's more likely an indirect connection between affluence and working. That's what's going on. So anyway, this is a problem that's facing humanity. China is an interesting case. They had the one-child policy, which they then finally stopped, I think about 2015. And now they put on the two-child policy, and now they've kind of got a three-child policy, although they're not calling it that. They're encouraging people to have kids. They basically went too long and too hard on the one-child policy, and they probably should have let the brake about 20 years earlier. But they didn't. I think even in an autocratic country like China, it's probably hard to change a policy like that. And so they've got this problem now that their population may start to fall too quickly, like everyone else. And again, not a lot of immigration going on there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And there we are. So this is a problem facing the entire species, potentially. It's interesting that this is occurring at a time where we're seeing a large number of feminism has come along and has caused a large number of men to essentially step away. Indirectly, it's caused by feminism, men to step away because of the misandric laws related to marriage and divorce and so forth. You've got a large number of men we've seen, and this is now getting repeated a lot more often. So you've probably heard this already, but the number of men who have not had sex in the last 12 months has dramatically gone up. I think there was a period of about 10 years, 2008 to 2018, I think it was, where it tripled. In that time, the proportion of women who hadn't had sex in 12 months went up a small proportion. But it's primarily men who are doing this. So, and this is happening at a time when there's already a demographic problem. So that's forming it to be quite a perfect storm in that regard. So I think if societies want to fix this problem, they're going to really have to look at the misandric laws and look at why men are walking away. But of course, it seems to me that even if they were to fix these problems tomorrow, it'd be decades before you'd see there's essentially a whole lost generation of men saying, no, we're done. And it'd be the next generation coming up before you'd see the problem correcting. So this is a huge problem that it's probably now too late to stop with men essentially saying, nope, we're disengaging from a societal point of view. I mean, as I said, I've often said before, from a point of view of men doing this, I've always said I think they're making the rational choice for the situation they're in. So you'll never hear me criticizing the men for doing this because it's a rational choice. But from a societal point of view, huge problem. Absolutely huge problem.
Right.
And politicians haven't taken it seriously enough, and now it's probably too late to fix it, unfortunately. But we just have to weather it and try to fix it for the next generation.
Yep. When it comes to matters of sex, of course, just not having sex thing. Of course, we already know which sex is going to be blamed for not having sex. Like, it's but in all matters regarding sex, there's no way, women aren't uh put on the spot for anything regarding it. If the sex is bad, it's never her fault. If he doesn't want to have sex, that's his own fault.
Yeah.
If she doesn't want to have sex, it's probably because he screwed something up.
Yeah.
The onus is always on him, but we should be more unafraid to talk about how women screw sex up.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's right. Yeah, that goes right back to hypo agency, the tendency to defer agency away from, to push agency away from women. So that's right. Whatever's going wrong in the relationship, and the reason there isn't any sex, it's something to do with what the man did in general.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is, unfortunately, that's something our society does. Some people would argue that a lot of that's innate, and that comes back to gynocentrism. I tend to think that if there's an innate component, it's relatively small, and most of it is probably cultural. I think not every society does that, but we certainly do that to a large degree. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's demographic collapse. It's in summary, very serious issue, something that's been cooking for a while. Politicians are probably a bit late to the party in terms of fixing and addressing the problems facing men, which are indirectly causing some of this, not all of it, but some of it. There may be other reasons that other areas politicians are being too late and too slow to respond to. And now we've got this problem, and we just have to deal with it. Yeah. The last one I wanted to mention, it's a quick one. I just wanted to throw it in.
Yeah,
Men can't have it all. So you often you see a lot of articles. Women can't have it all. Okay, as a woman, I have to choose to work, or choose to be a stay-at-home mother. I can't have it all. That's the reality. You often hear that from conservatives, right? You can't have it all. You might hear the feminists saying you can have it all, right? Both arguments are predicated on the notion that men can have it all. In fact, the arguments saying women can have it, we can't have it all, often say men can have it all. You're not a man, so you can't have it all, right?
Right.
I've been thinking about this recently, and I've concluded men can't have it all, actually. So as most men will go to work, this is what is expected of them, and indeed many men will desire to do this. Okay, they will want to work, and they'll want to provide for their family. Not to say the woman won't also provide for the family, but if anybody's working full time, it's probably the man. And both the man and the woman have generally that they're happy with that arrangement. And I don't often speak about myself, but I'll say this is certainly my personal experience too, as someone who has worked full time and so forth. You don't get to do everything with your kids. Okay, you don't get to be there as much with them as the parent that's working, who's often the man, as the parent who's staying at home. I'm very fortunate that I've been able to be at many of the first. My daughter's first, I was there the first time she ever ate solid food. That's because over the years I worked from home a lot, and we were able to work things out. So the day she ate from home, the day she ate for the first time was a day I was working from home, for example. So that was something that we were able to do. But when it comes to things like going to school events, there's plays and whatnot, and I would say I've probably been to 50% of them. Okay. And I wanted to go to all of them, but I couldn't. Right. So I eventually concluded men can't have it all. So why should women be able to have it all when men can't either?
Right. Exactly.
If the women are aspiring for something that even the men can't get.
Yep.
That's all I had to say.
They deserve it all, Robert. Women deserve everything, right? They deserve to have men who have it all, give it all.
Yes, right. Yes. So there we are.
Right.
Yep. So the next time I hear a woman say, I can't have it all like a man, I'm just going to say, well, men can't have it all either. So,
right. Yeah. We don't have it all.
No, absolutely not. There are choices to be made, and you have to just, yep. So there it is.
Exactly.
As I said, it was a quick one. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
It's something that's really, over the last few months, I've really concluded. Yes.
Right.
And there we are. I think it's been a good episode.
I think it's been a good episode.
Yes, I've done a lot of talking.
Yeah, sure. I mean, last episode we we said something about going to touch on the Lauren Southern thing, and I'll tell you the truth. I was gonna watch her video or something like that, but it seemed like such a dreary thing. It's like I didn't know if I wanted to sit there for however long that was going to be. Like, was it like 2 hours or so?
Something like that,
Uh,
hour and a half, 2 hours. Yeah.
yeah, but so I kind of want to just do footnotes. Do you have
Yes.
footnotes? um,
Why don't we leave it for next time?
okay, well,
Uh,
all right, yeah, yeah. I
yeah.
don't know if I should just drag it on. It's happened. We already know she's an idiot. Uh, you
So
know,
I did watch it, although I admit I did skip or fast forward through a bit in the middle where she was did seem to be kind of waffling on for a while
all right,
actually,
all right.
about her own
Well,
personal problems.
mhm. Well, I am gonna watch Royal Tomasi's riff on it one. So
Yes, I haven't
maybe
watched that. All right, I'll watch that too, and then let's discuss it next time. Good stuff.
okay, yeah, yeah. For real, Dick, next time. Yeah, I know
Exactly.
it's been
That's
like
right.
4 weeks and we still haven't talked about it. But
No, that's okay though. I mean, we missed an episode for personal reasons, so that's all right. It's fine. I think it's still fairly topical. Yeah.
all right, sounds good.
Uh, there's just very briefly there's stuff happening in the Brittany Higgins case here in Australia.
Oh,
To
true.
summarise, this very quickly, she accused someone of raping her in Parliament House essentially because it occurred in Parliament House and they were both employed by ministers. It was a bit like putting kerosene around and then throwing a match on it. Absolutely exploded. The trial was the jury was eventually dismissed due to juror misconduct, and the state has said they're not going to try the matter again. Just basing that on saying on her mental health. That's their argument. So anyway, stuff has happened since then. The A politician is actually suing Brittany Higgins' partner, male partner, over some tweets he made during the entire process. And there's some other stuff going on. We'll talk about that more next time because we'll know more. But the last episode has not been written in the Brittany Higgins saga. Apparently, there's going to be more court cases. It would appear. Yes.
Mm.
So I'm waiting. I'm looking forward to the miniseries.
Yeah, yeah,
Great. Thank you very much. Great episode.
yeah, absolutely.
Talk
All
to you
right,
soon.
see ya.
Bye bye.
Bye.